The checkpoint is down, not temporarily suspended, not rerouted through a secondary terminal, down, permanently. The bureaucratic machinery that used to process your movement dissolved overnight, and the only thing standing between you and where you need to be is 40 kilometers of monitored terrain, sensor grids calibrated to detect thermal signatures, and a border architecture designed by an occupation force that understands one thing better than anything else: control. You think the official routes are just closed. You're wrong. They were designed to be closed. Every official crossing you've ever used was engineered with a kill switch embedded in its operational architecture, not as a contingency, as a feature. When movement of population becomes inconvenient for those managing the occupation, the switch gets thrown, and every legitimate route you memorized, every document you prepared, every contact you cultivated at official terminals becomes worthless weight in your pack. Here's what they don't tell you. The geography doesn't care about the politics. Terrain predates every occupation force that ever existed. The water doesn't stop flowing because someone declared it a restricted zone. The ridgelines don't relocate because an alien administrative decree redrew the boundary. And the people who understood this before the occupation sealed the checkpoints, those people built 3 categories of exit that no administrative action can permanently eliminate. Today, you're going to learn all 3. I've processed the movement archives from before and after occupation sealing events across 12 documented collapse scenarios. I've run probability models on every documented successful crossing when official routes were compromised. And I've cataloged the failure patterns that got people captured, killed, or simply stranded permanently in the wrong jurisdiction. The patterns are consistent, the mistakes are predictable, and the solutions have existed longer than the occupation has. The first technique doesn't require special equipment. It doesn't require contacts. It requires cartographic understanding that predates every border drawn in the last century. Natural corridors. Every political boundary on this planet was drawn by humans, and every human who drew those lines knew something the tourists didn't. Borders follow geography when it's convenient to administer, and they ignore geography when the terrain makes enforcement impossible. The zones where administration was difficult, those zones stayed difficult. The mountains that were too expensive to fully sensor grid. The river deltas where seasonal flooding made permanent infrastructure impractical. The forest corridors where canopy coverage defeated aerial surveillance. These aren't secrets. They're engineering limitations. And engineering limitations don't disappear when an occupation force takes over, they inherit them. Drone observes, natural terrain features exhibit consistent coverage gaps in sensor deployment. Protagonist response, because sensors cost resources to install and maintain, physics limits detection range, budgets limit sensor density. Occupation forces inherit the same logistical math that stumped every border authority before them. The practical application requires 3 specific data sets. Topographic maps showing natural drainage patterns because water always finds the path of least resistance, and those paths existed before fences. Sensor infrastructure documentation showing where coverage concentrates, because occupation forces cluster detection equipment at high probability crossing points, leaving low probability terrain under-resourced. And seasonal data, because a river that's impassable in spring becomes a knee-deep ford in late summer. A marsh that's impenetrable in wet season becomes a navigable reed flat when dry. Terrain is not static. It shifts with season. And the sensor grid calibrated for peak season conditions loses effectiveness during off-season windows the original installation engineers didn't prioritize. Before we go further, this archive exists because the systems designed to keep you stationary don't want you understanding your options. Subscribe and activate notifications. You're building a knowledge base they can't confiscate. Drop a comment with the most critical gap in your current movement plan. Now, back to technique. The second technique is older than any nation-state, and it's suppressed not through illegality, but through deliberate cultural invisibility. Informal networks. Every sealed border in history generated them within 72 hours of sealing. Not because people are criminal. Because people have relatives, resources, and obligations on both sides of lines drawn by governments they didn't elect. The networks that persist longest share specific structural characteristics that make them resilient against interdiction. They're decentralized. No single node knows the full route. Each participant knows one link in the chain. The person who moves you from point A to point B doesn't know who operates point C. This compartmentalization isn't tradecraft paranoia. It's rational operational security developed through centuries of informal movement experience. When one node gets compromised, the chain doesn't unravel. The node burns. The rest adapts. The second characteristic is economic asymmetry. Informal networks don't operate on ideology. They operate on value exchange. What do you carry? What skills do you hold? What information do you possess that has more value on the other side than where you currently stand? Here's the thing most people miss about informal networks. You don't find them. You become findable by them. The networks that move people successfully are not advertised. They're accessed through demonstrated need, demonstrated trustworthiness, and demonstrated value contribution to the community operating adjacent to the border. The mistake is treating network access as a transaction. It's not. It's a relationship built over time in environments of genuine shared risk. And that relationship begins not at the moment you need to move, but weeks before, when you're contributing to the network's stability rather than demanding from its resources. The third technique is the one nobody discusses openly because it sounds implausible until you examine the infrastructure archaeology. Every major border zone in this world was built on top of something else. Sewage systems from pre-occupation urban expansion. Railway tunnels that became redundant when newer lines were built above them. Utility corridors built for power and water infrastructure in eras when the border hadn't been established yet. These weren't designed as crossing infrastructure. They were designed as civil engineering, and civil engineering predates and outlasts every administrative boundary imposed on the surface. The infrastructure archaeology approach requires 3 investigation phases. Historical documentation review, which means accessing pre-occupation municipal records, infrastructure planning documents, and civil engineering archives from the period before administrative control was formalized. These records were rarely digitized comprehensively, which means occupation surveillance systems that monitor digital information access can't flag your research if you're working from physical archives. The second phase is surface mapping, identifying the topographic signatures that indicate subsurface infrastructure. The subtle grade changes that follow buried pipe runs, the vegetation patterns over disturbed soil from historical construction, the micro-elevation changes that indicate void spaces below grade. And the third phase is reconnaissance through progressive investigation, which means beginning from the known end of any documented infrastructure corridor and following it in the direction you need to travel. Drone interjects. Query. Pre-occupation infrastructure records contain security classifications restricting access. Protagonist. Everything that threatens control gets classified. That doesn't make it inaccessible. It makes it worth finding. Classification is just a filing system for inconvenient engineering. Here's what the occupation force understood that most displaced people don't. Sealing a surface border is logistically manageable. Sealing subsurface infrastructure completely is economically impractical. The sensor density required to monitor every kilometer of historical underground infrastructure beneath a major urban-adjacent border zone would exceed the resource allocation of any occupation authority. They know it. They don't solve it. They manage the risk by controlling information access, discouraging research, and ensuring the population thinks about borders as surface phenomena only. The moment you start thinking 3-dimensionally about the geography of control, you've already partially exited the system designed to manage you. But technique without preparation is just theory. Each of these 3 approaches carries specific failure modes that kill the unprepared faster than the border itself. Natural corridor crossing fails when movement timing is wrong. Not because the corridor doesn't work. Because the corridor that's a viable ford in September becomes a lethal current in April. Crossing timing requires intelligence, not courage. You need to know what the terrain is doing right now, not what it looked like on the archive photograph. The specific intelligence requirements for natural corridor timing include current weather pattern analysis for upstream catchment areas, not local weather at the crossing point. A river crossing that looks perfect at your location becomes impassable 6 hours after a storm you didn't know happened 100 kilometers upstream. Flood pulse travel time in major drainage systems can run from 6 to 48 hours depending on catchment size and channel gradient. You need to know what happened upstream in the last 48 hours before you commit to a water corridor. Informal network failure mode is different. It's not logistical, it's social. The network breaks when you introduce an element the community identifies as liability before you've established value. Moving too fast through trust development. asking operational questions before you've demonstrated investment in community stability, signaling desperation. Networks carry people they consider assets. They shed people they consider liabilities. And the assessment happens fast, based on observable behavior patterns, not on what you tell them about yourself. What you say is noise. What you do in the first 72 hours of community integration is the actual signal they're reading. The infrastructure archaeology failure mode is environmental. Historical utility infrastructure wasn't designed for human movement. It was designed for pipes, cables, and service access. Air quality in long-disused underground infrastructure can be lethally deficient in oxygen, lethally concentrated in methane, or lethally saturated with biological contamination from decades of organic accumulation. You don't know which you're walking into until you're inside. And inside is a lethal position to discover your atmosphere assessment equipment is insufficient. Minimum viable atmosphere assessment for historical infrastructure entry requires 3 independent detection capabilities: oxygen percentage, combustible gas presence, and carbon monoxide levels. Not 1, not 2, 3. Because single-point detection failure in a confined space environment is a permanent failure. The infrastructure approach works. It just works permanently for people who treat the environmental conditions as engineering problems requiring technical solutions, not inconveniences to be minimized. Here's the pattern that connects all 3 techniques. They each exploit the same fundamental asymmetry. Control systems are expensive to maintain and calibrate. Geography, informal social networks, and historical infrastructure are free to exist. The occupation force, like every control system before it, must continuously invest resources to maintain its restrictions. The terrain invests nothing. The water continues flowing. The people who share risk continue finding ways to exchange value. The underground infrastructure continues existing below the surface. Every control system that has ever operated on this planet has faced the same mathematical reality. Restriction degrades at the edges. The edges are where the exits are. And the exits were built before the restrictions ever existed. You've now covered 3 non-administrative crossing techniques: natural corridor navigation using terrain permanence and sensor gap analysis, informal network integration using trust-based community value exchange, and infrastructure archaeology using preoccupation civil engineering to move below the detection layer. These aren't exotic or experimental. They're documented, they're ancient, and they work for the same reason the occupation's restrictions don't work perfectly. Physics and human social behavior are older than administrative control, and they don't take orders. The pattern you've observed across all 3 techniques is not coincidental. Every official route you've ever been offered was designed with a deactivation mechanism. Every piece of movement infrastructure the system wanted you to depend on was built with dependency as a feature. The terrain doesn't have a kill switch. The informal network doesn't have a central server for the occupation force to shut down. The historical infrastructure doesn't require permission from anyone currently managing the surface. This is how control systems function. They build your dependency into the systems they provide. When they seal the systems, they assume they've sealed you. They're wrong. What crosses that border is not equipment. It's not documentation. It's knowledge of what existed before they built the walls. You can't buy that knowledge from the systems that benefit from you not having it. You build it by learning terrain, cultivating trust, and understanding the infrastructure archaeology of wherever you're standing. That's not a survival technique. That's a posture. And the difference between a posture and a technique is the difference between someone who escapes once and someone who moves freely through a world designed to keep them stationary. What other closed-route bypass techniques belong in this archive? You've moved through restricted territory. You've found passages the occupation doesn't acknowledge. Drop it in the comments. Not because it helps me, but because the person watching this 6 months from now, facing a sealed route in a zone you've already exited, that person's probability of success improves with every data point this community adds. That's how informal networks actually function. Physics doesn't enforce borders.